One man may be the ancestor of 16 million people alive today, but DNA revealed the real story is even stranger than that. In 2003, a team of geneticists led by Chris Tyler Smith at Oxford University published a study in the American Journal of Human Genetics that became one of the most widely cited and most widely misunderstood findings in the history of population genetics. Analyzing Y chromosome data from over 2,000 men across a vast swath of Asia, stretching from the Pacific coast of China to the Caspian Sea. The researchers identified a single genetic lineage that appeared with startling frequency across an enormous geographic range. Approximately 8% of men in this region, roughly 16 million people, or about 0.5% of the entire male population of the world at the time, carried a nearly identical Y chromosome signature. A degree of genetic concentration almost never observed across such a vast and ethnically diverse territory. The pattern of its distribution mapped with uncanny precision onto the historical boundaries of the Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous land empire in human history, built in the 13th century by Genghis Khan and expanded by his descendants across China, Central Asia, Persia, and into Eastern Europe. The researchers proposed an explanation that was, on its surface, both shocking and historically plausible. A genetic signature this widespread, this concentrated, and this recently originated, the mutation pattern suggested an age of roughly 1,000 years, could only have spread this far, this fast. Through one mechanism, the reproductive success of a single man and his close male relatives, magnified across generations by political power, social status, and the structural realities of dynastic succession in the Mongol Empire. Genghis Khan and his sons and grandsons, who ruled vast territories and maintained large harems as a matter of imperial practice, were positioned to father an extraordinary number of children. Historical chronicles describe Genghis Khan's grandson Kublai Khan, who would later rule China as emperor, maintaining dozens of consorts in addition to his principal wives, a pattern of reproductive access that, repeated across generations of male descendants ruling territories from Persia to Korea, could plausibly compound into the kind of genetic signal the 2003 study detected. Combined with the cultural and political privilege afforded to descendants of the Khan across the territories the Mongols controlled for centuries, this reproductive advantage could compound across generations into a genetic signal detectable in millions of men today. The finding became, almost instantly, one of the most famous stories in popular genetics. It appeared in textbooks, documentaries, and 1,000 articles about the most successful reproductive strategy in human history. Genghis Khan, already legendary for the scale of his conquests, became equally legendary for the scale of his genetic legacy. The phrase Genghis Khan haplogroup entered popular usage as though it were an established scientific fact rather than a carefully hedged hypothesis. The original 2003 paper was, in fact, considerably more cautious than its popular reception. The researchers could not test DNA directly from Genghis Khan's remains. His burial site has never been found, deliberately concealed according to Mongol tradition specifically to prevent looting or desecration. The connection to Genghis Khan himself was an inference, a reasonable hypothesis built on historical timing and geographic distribution, not a directly confirmed genetic fact. For 2 decades, this inference held as the dominant explanation, repeated and amplified through popular science media, until it calcified into something resembling settled fact. Television documentaries, magazine features, and viral internet posts repeated the 16 million descendants statistic so frequently and so confidently that the original scientific caution embedded in the 2003 paper was almost entirely lost in translation. Then, beginning in the late 2010s and accelerating through subsequent years, more detailed genetic and genealogical research began to complicate the picture in ways that the original 2003 study could not have anticipated. Given the technological limitations of its era, a more comprehensive 2023 analysis, drawing on substantially expanded ancient DNA datasets and refined molecular dating techniques unavailable 2 decades earlier. Revisited the age and origin of the so-called Genghis Khan haplogroup with considerably more precision. The results complicated the original timeline in a significant way, rather than originating with Genghis Khan himself in the late 12th century. The genetic and statistical evidence increasingly suggested that the founding mutation defining this lineage was considerably older, potentially originating centuries before Genghis Khan's birth. Embedded within a broader Mongolic or Central Asian ruling lineage from which Genghis Khan himself may have descended, rather than one he personally originated. This kind of revision, researchers noted, is a routine and healthy feature of population genetics as methods improve, even when it means walking back a finding that had already become a fixture of popular science culture. This distinction matters enormously, even though it sounds subtle. The original popular narrative imagined a single extraordinarily successful man whose own reproductive output, magnified by his sons and grandsons, flooded the male gene pool of Asia within a few generations. The revised picture suggests something different, a successful aristocratic lineage, possibly stretching back through multiple generations of Mongolic nobility before Genghis Khan was even born, that conferred reproductive and political advantages on its male members across an extended period of time, with Genghis Khan representing not the origin point of this genetic success, but rather its most spectacularly successful beneficiary and amplifier. The empire he built took an already successful lineage and projected it across the largest contiguous territory ever controlled by a single political entity, multiplying an existing advantage rather than creating an entirely new one from a single founder. This reframing connects to something genealogists and historians of the Mongol period had long suspected from textual sources, but could not previously confirm genetically. Mongol political ideology placed enormous emphasis on descent from a sacred founding lineage, traced in Mongol oral and written tradition to a legendary ancestor figure described in the secret history of the Mongols. The foundational 13th century chronicle of Mongol origins that blends genuine historical memory with mythic genealogy reaching back to a wolf and a doe said to have crossed an inland sea. Members of this lineage, known as the Borjigin clan, held exclusive claim to political legitimacy across the Mongol world for centuries after Genghis Khan's death. A privilege so deeply entrenched that even after the empire fragmented into competing khanates, only descendants of this clan could legitimately claim the title of Khan across most of the Mongol successor states. A political rule so rigid that it persisted in some form into the era of the later Mughal emperors of India, who traced their own legitimacy partly through Borjigin descent. If the genetic data now suggests this clan's reproductive and genetic success predates Genghis Khan himself, it would mean the social and political structures favoring this lineage's reproduction were already in place before he was born, and that his conquests functioned as an amplifier of an existing genetic and dynastic advantage rather than its point of origin. The 2023 reanalysis does not erase Genghis Khan's genetic significance. It complicates and historicizes it. He remains, by any reasonable reading of the evidence, one of the most reproductively significant individuals in recorded human history. And his conquests undeniably accelerated and expanded the geographic spread of his lineage's genetic signature far beyond what it would have achieved without the scale of Mongol territorial expansion. But the popular image of a single man single-handedly seeding the Y chromosomes of millions through personal reproductive ambition alone is, the more recent evidence suggests, an oversimplification of a more layered story involving generations of dynastic advantage that long predated his birth and continued, in modified form, for centuries after his death through the political structures his empire established. There is a deeper irony embedded in this story that becomes visible only once the genetic timeline is properly understood. Genghis Khan's conquests killed an estimated 40 million people, by some historical estimates representing as much as 10% of the world's population at the time, through warfare, starvation, and the deliberate destruction of cities that resisted Mongol authority. Entire urban populations across Central Asia and Persia were annihilated in retaliatory campaigns following resistance. The destruction of cities like Merv and Nishapur stands among the deadliest documented massacres in pre-modern history. The same campaigns of conquest that produced this catastrophic human cost also produced the conditions for an unprecedented genetic legacy, spreading a single aristocratic lineage across a continent through political domination, dynastic marriage practices, and the systematic privileging of Borjigin descent across territories from Korea to Hungary. The genetic signature carried by 16 million men today is, in this sense, a kind of biological monument to one of history's most violent and most transformative periods of conquest, written not in stone or in chronicles, but in the Y chromosomes of people who, in the overwhelming majority of cases, have no idea this connection exists. There is a man living today in a small village in Kazakhstan, or perhaps in Inner Mongolia, or perhaps in a city in modern Russia, whose Y chromosome carries a genetic signature connecting him to a ruling lineage that shaped the medieval world more thoroughly than almost any other political dynasty in human history. He may know nothing of this connection. He may simply be a farmer, a teacher, a shopkeeper, entirely unaware that his paternal line traces back through centuries of nobility to a clan whose name was once synonymous with conquest across 2 continents, whose decisions reshaped trade routes, redrew borders, and determined the fate of empires from the Pacific to the Danube. The DNA carries no memory of the violence, the politics, or the empire that distributed it so widely. It carries only the pattern itself, waiting as it always does, for science to develop the tools necessary to finally read what it has been recording all along. History is not written in books. It is written in genomes. And the story written in the Y chromosomes of millions of Asian men was never quite the simple story the headlines told. It is older, stranger, and more deeply entangled with the structures of dynastic power than the popular version ever acknowledged, a story not of one man's reproductive ambition, but of an aristocratic lineage that had already learned, generations before Genghis Khan's birth, how to translate political power into biological persistence, and that found in him its most spectacular and most consequential vehicle. A reminder that even our most famous genetic discoveries are subject to revision as the science improves, and that the truth, when it finally arrives, is almost always more complicated and more interesting than the story that made the original headlines.